Hello and welcome to Being Well. I'm Forrest Hanson. If you're new to the podcast, thanks for listening today. And if you've listened before, welcome back. If you're listening to a podcast like ours, or if you're interested in personal growth, psychology, and self-help broadly, you've probably bumped into the idea of manifesting, and maybe even the law of attraction, which was popularized by the book The Secret. The basic idea behind manifesting is that our thoughts impact the world around us, and we attract to us things that have a similar energy to the thoughts that we think. So if we think positive thoughts, we get positive things. And if we think negative thoughts, well, not so much. This means that just by changing how we think, we can change our lives. And we've explored many ideas that are similar to that here on this podcast. For example, cognitive restructuring is a process in cognitive behavioral therapy where people work to challenge and deconstruct unhelpful thoughts and replace them with more useful ones. CBT is pretty much the most research-validated approach to therapy out there, so there has to be something useful there, right? Talking about manifesting is complicated because our thoughts really do matter, and there's a psychology behind the ideas that are embedded in manifesting that is based on some very useful and very, very real stuff. And it makes sense to explore that stuff on a podcast like ours, but the problem, at least for me, is that manifesting is also closely tied to a bunch of ideas that are the trifecta of extremely popular, largely disconnected from reality, and, at least in my opinion, kind of actively harmful to people. So we're going to be wading through manifesting today, and to help me do that, I am joined by clinical psychologist Dr. Rick Hanson. So Dad, how are you doing today?
I'm good, and I'm suddenly thinking that podcast hosts rush in where angels fear to tread. What's the line? Abandon hope, ye who enter here. The catacombs of the Colosseum.
That's how I'm feeling before this one, buddy.
Something like that. This topic territory. Okay, we're going to be careful.
Yeah, for sure. And for those of you watching on YouTube, Rick and I may have manifested wearing essentially the same shirt today. So, do with that what you will. But okay, Dad, I want to start with you,
at
actually.
The quantum level.
Yes, we're connected at the quantum. We're quantum entanglement right
That's
here,
it.
Dad. It's
superposition
happening.
right there.
It's happening. Oh my God. Wow. Life imitating art. Okay, I want to start with you, Dad, because it would be really easy for me to just fly off the handle here at the start, as I have done in some of our...
Dude, you've already started. Just keep going.
Some of our pre-production meetings about this topic, if you want to call them that, which is essentially the two of us just sitting down and bullshitting about stuff, but in a great way, So I actually want to start with you.
Yep.
As somebody, for starters, who has been in the field for a long time, we've talked about this. You were there, Dad, in the primordial ooze of the 60s and 70s when some of these ideas were starting to kind of take their first little steps onto land. When you hear the word manifesting, what does that mean to you, particularly in your more kind of practical, psychological approach to things?
Let's start with the way you put it, that our thoughts make a difference. And to understand manifesting, the key question is, how do they make a difference? And there are, in my mind, 4 useful potential mechanisms of action to think about. And as long as we're clear about the how that we're talking about, then we're on at least understandable ground. Okay? So the first mechanism of action is, I'll just call it plain vanilla Big Bang reality. We do cognitive restructuring. We wake up in the morning and we think to ourselves, it's been too long since I went to the dentist for a checkup. My mouth's a little sore. I should make an appointment. And we make an appointment. So our thoughts affected reality in that very straightforward, understandable, common sense way. That category is crystal clear. There's no dispute about that category. You are very much centered in that category. That's awesome.
I love that category. Yep. I live for that category.
And I think it's really important to pick up a theme that we'll be returning to again and again. It's really good, however much you trust in God, tie your camel. Okay?
Yeah.
Don't forget this first category. Okay. The second category, possibly, would be mechanisms of action that operate within the natural Big Bang universe in ways that are not yet understood by science. If you think about what's understood in the domain of science, it's a gradually expanding circle. So we're expanding what's known. It's not yet established through science, but it's still a natural phenomenon. That's the second category. Okay. Now we're starting to move out of the natural phenomena into the third purported category of causality, factors, mechanisms of action that are supernatural. Clairvoyance in here, telekinesis, action at a distance, reincarnation. There are people who believe that there was some kind of intercession on their part by, let's say, angels or spirit energies or energies. Let's say they went to a particular sacred place, they got in touch with the energies there, and they experienced a kind of a healing. And they would say that the mechanism of action is a supernatural mechanism of action. Okay. And I'm not arguing for the existence of that. I'm just naming it. And then the fourth potential mechanism of action is a category that for me is meaningfully distinct from the supernatural, and I'll call it the transcendental, the divine. Some process whereby through opening to the divine, seeking God's help, there's a sense of divine intervention. Okay. So these are the four categories. And I find it just helpful to be clear about what we're naming. So I just want to lay that map out. And I'm responding to your question, okay, how do you think about it, Pops? Well, I think about it in terms of those four categories.
In terms of those four boxes, yeah. And so I want to ask you about the first of those boxes, Dad, because clearly we talk about on the show all the time about how our beliefs about things matter. What we believe about ourselves, what we believe about the world around us. Like that really affects how we behave out in the world. And manifesting, to like really, really boil it down, is essentially what's bringing in our mind out into reality, right? And those beliefs, those thoughts play a really, really big role in that process. Now, obviously, believing that you can accomplish something is going to make it more likely that you do accomplish it than not believing that you can accomplish something, right? And people coming into a overall sense of their power and capability as an individual is like a very, very useful part of that process. Now, I assume that you put those kinds of psychological factors into that first bucket, but I just wanted to double check that with you.
100%. And
okay, great.
Here's where, if you'll indulge me, a very brief description of the mind-body process. So the body is here. There is a body. There's a body with a nervous system. The function of that nervous system is to process information. Information is intangible. Bodies are tangible. You cannot weigh a signal. You cannot hold a piece of data in your hand like you could a stone. And yet, information is a natural phenomenon. So our thoughts as experiences that rise to the level of consciousness relies upon, at least partially, if not entirely, information processing in the nervous system. So we have a flow of experiences that involve flows of intangible information that are represented by tangible flows of neural activity inside tangible structures in the nervous system, nested in the tangible body altogether. So repeated flows of mental activity involve repeated flows of neural activity, which leave lasting traces behind. And so when we speak about in the first category, and even potentially the second category, we're talking about flows of information. Yes, it's intangible, and still it exists in the natural universe. That's kind of a framework here. And sometimes I think people get confused because they think, oh, my thoughts are somehow intangible, therefore they must be supernatural in some way distinct from the natural frame. And actually, no, information and information processing is a natural phenomenon.
So to kind of sum up what we've said so far, in my approach, in the kind of more material, psychological frame, which is where I like to live personally for a whole bunch of different reasons that we'll probably talk about in a minute, I think that manifesting gets down to a series of maybe like 3 or 4 things. First, self-belief and self-efficacy, which we talk about on the podcast all the time. If you don't believe that you are capable of doing a thing, it is going to be really, really hard for you to accomplish that thing. So yes, a form of manifesting is changing those beliefs, and then we can bring those beliefs more into reality. The second part of it, I would describe as like goal clarity. In order to manifest something, like if you go through even the more psycho-spiritual versions of this, a big part of them is visualizing the thing that you want a lot of the time, right? And so you need to know what you want in order to visualize what you want. And one of the things we also talk about on the podcast regularly is how difficult it is for many people to really identify what they want from life. And so having that as a big part of this process, I think, is immensely valuable for people.
Yeah.
Then the third piece of it that is going to be a real topic for us here is dedicated effort. You know what you want. You believe that you can do it. Now what? And the now what is discipline. It's applying effort over time in order to get the result that you really care about. And so cultivating the caring and having the belief in yourself are like the two required precursors to applying that effort in a dedicated way over time. If you don't have those, you're not going to apply the effort. And then alongside those three things, I would kind of put another fourth bucket that has a lot of little things in it that are all really important, but they're a little fuzzier. I would describe these as maybe more like mindset-based processes. These are things like developing psychological flexibility or rational optimism, what Brad Stolberg, who I've talked to on the podcast, refers to as tragic optimism, like a search for meaning amid difficulty in life and an acceptance of that. Alongside that, maybe becoming more growth-oriented, having a growth mindset. These are all really important and really valuable things. There's a reason that we spend a lot of time talking about them on the podcast because they are so essential for people. So in anything that I say kind of from here on out, taking some pot shots at the more kind of metaphysical versions of manifesting, I don't want to lose the value of those fundamental practices, which I do think are really tied to some of the more psychologically inclined versions of manifesting that you see out there.
I'm really glad we're talking about this topic. We're going to spend the bulk of our time focusing on very practical how-tos, but the framing itself is really interesting, and it's relevant because I've seen a lot of people, Forrest, get into a lot of trouble basically really investing deeply in supernatural and even transcendental mechanisms of action without tying their camel, without really, really taking care of the first and even the second categories here.
Yeah.
And I want to bring in, I think it's relevant, the case of the Buddha. So here's the Buddha, historic Buddha, 2,500 years ago, individual. He did not claim any transcendental or divine powers. He lived at a time in which it was taken for granted that there were transcendental and even supernatural, and also, as well as supernatural mechanisms of action. And yet his focus was almost entirely in the first frame, in the first category. We have the opening lines famously of the Dhammapada, the mind is the maker of all things. And as basically the mind goes, like the oxen drawing the cart, so the cart must follow. And he's not talking there about the mind somehow manifesting wealth out in the world. He's talking about everything you've talked about, while also in his worldview, devas, discarnate entities, spirits, cosmological realms, rebirth. It was just taken for granted. There was an appreciation of all that insofar as it is of use in that first category, in down-to-earth, everyday management of all the camels in your own mind. And I think, in a way, that's a good model for us. Like, okay, if it's useful for you, if those supernatural and even transcendental, particularly with regard to timelessness and unconditionality, if that's of use to you, super duper, but don't forget what you do with each day and each breath.
That's great, Dad. And I do want to take some time here to contrast what we've been talking about so far, the more psychologically inclined version of this, with maybe the less psychologically inclined version of this, the version that exists in that second or third category, if not the fourth category altogether. Because I agree with almost everything that you're saying here, if not everything, and the things that I have any disagreement about, my disagreement's pretty mild, if it exists at all. But I think that you are describing a very charitable interpretation of this in my estimation. And so I think that it could be helpful.
That's why you agree with it.
Which is why I agree with it. You're being very charitable, I would say here. And so I want to outline some of the aspects of more kind of classic manifesting, to put it that way, that I think people sometimes fall into some holes here. And I want to describe what the holes are, which can I think help us understand the thing as a complete whole that we can then think about. And whole with a WH there.
Yeah. In other words, what bugs you so much about what some people say?
Yes. So, okay. So I think that uncertainty is where charlatanism just pigs out. Charlatanism loves some uncertainty because when we say we're not sure yet, wow, you can inject we're not sure yet with all kinds of stuff. And that's historically where people have been exploited by people who have ulterior motives. So let's go back to, I think it's 2006. This is when The Secret was published. It was published by a TV writer named Rhonda Bryan, who I think was Australian, if I'm remembering correctly. And it expresses something called the law of attraction, which is what a lot of this is based on. Now, the law of attraction is a very basic idea that, again, has aspects of it that feel really true to us. It's based on 3 principles. The first one is that people and their thoughts are made from pure energy. The second is like energy attracts like energy. And the third one is thoughts become things. Now, this means that everything a person wants in life can be attracted by believing in the outcome the person wants, repeatedly thinking about it, and then maintaining positive emotional states in order to attract it. Again, there are versions of this that we can do psychologically that do have some aspects of that. The problem for the law of attraction, and maybe The Secret more broadly, is that how any of this works is not very well described ever. There's generally a lot of hand waving in the direction of quantum physics. And this is one of those situations where if somebody just said, I have faith that this is the case, I would shrug, say, okay, man, and move on with my life. Because that's a matter of faith. The whole idea of faith is that it's not based on evidence. If you had evidence, you wouldn't need to have faith. That's the whole idea here, right? And I'm fine with that. But I think where we really get into problem is we get into a lot of psychobabble and technobabble that try to ascribe evidence to things that really don't have a lot of it. And that's historically where a lot of problems have been created for people. So that to me is my core gripe with manifesting and The Secret, where there is kind of a lot of allusion to physical mechanisms of action that, as near as we can tell, just do not exist. Maybe they're in that second category where, who knows, 100 years from now, we'll discover some mysterious way in which our thoughts impact material reality. I'm skeptical. And, I think that if that is happening, it's happening through those more psychological mechanisms. But I think to kind of sum it up, that's where I think we really get into trouble here.
Reflecting here, I think I have maybe 2 points about what you're just saying here. The first is, yes, it is possible to gussy up category 1 or even category 2 processes that are naturalistic, to gussy them up with metaphysical, supernatural explanations that are popular in some quarters and might sell a lot of books and interest a lot of people. And for me, there's something about that that's, I won't say dishonest, but there's something about it that distorts the truth. In other words, takes very, very commonsensical explanations and describes them in very supernatural or exotic, otherwise exotic ways.
I am comfortable describing it as at least a little bit dishonest, but yes, I agree with you. Otherwise, you're not. So I'll say that even if you won't.
And my squirm about that, it goes in 2 directions. One, for the record, I really do think that in my own ontology structure, there really are 3rd and 4th category factors. And I'm not going to argue that point, but
No, I totally understand that that's real for you, and I
yeah.
get
So
that.
for
And I
me,
think it's very honest that you feel that way.
Yeah, that's right. And I'm leery of, I'll call it new agey type explanations of what are actually very common sense, natural ways of getting things done in your life. I feel like that undervalues and devalues that which is actually supernatural or actually transcendental. It cheapens that space on the one hand. And on the other hand, it serves the function often of diverting people from taking care of their camels in very down-to-earth and common sense and immediately obvious ways that are not glamorized with a lot of quantum physics hand-waving. Having said all that, and established my leg in category 1 and category 2, okay, good. I want to also say, on the other hand, that this process of creating doubt is often used in the natural frame as well. Think about the doubts that were cast on the health consequences of cigarette smoking, for example, by the tobacco industry, or the motivated doubts produced by the petrochemical industry and their allies politically over the last 30 years about the ways in which greenhouse gases actually do produce global warming, inevitably. So it's not just the airy-fairy, folks who are driving a bus through that which is not yet absolutely firmly known. Part 1. Part 2, I think we need to be careful about scientism, the new secular religion of the age. And a fundamentally scientific attitude is that the absence of evidence is not itself evidence of absence. There is much that's not yet known, such as in psychology. There's a very strong critique that one of the worst things that ever happened to psychotherapy was the injection of so-called evidence-based practices into it that have tended to have the effect of, turning psychotherapy as a kind of a soulful, profound process for many people into a fairly narrow prescriptive movement through a series of manuals, because those can be structured and studied easily. Just because something cannot be studied easily doesn't mean that it's not important. And it doesn't also mean that that which can be studied should be necessarily the basis for how we help people who are suffering. So I just want to kind of drop that in as the other side of the story.
Yeah, there's some fair points, Dad. What I would say about a lot of that is that another fundamental part of the scientific method is that the burden of proof is on the person who has the hypothesis. Correct. Bottom line here. And what I think you see in a lot of the manifesting stuff is an inversion of that. There's this, well, we don't know, so maybe it's true. And then people take the we don't know, maybe it's true, and turn it into their whole modus operandi for life, right? And that's where I think like a lot of this stuff starts to break down. I do want to spend a very short period of time here talking about some of the reasons that having that more psychospiritual approach, and particularly the ways it's specifically laid out in the law of attraction, and why I'm focusing on the law of attraction is because it's incredibly popular. And so that's why it's my current pinata here. But you can kind of break these issues into 3 different categories. The first category is that we're constructing an underlying model of reality where the world physically is fundamentally changed by our thoughts and feelings. Now, this has a couple of big problems with it. I'm going to set aside the first big problem, which is that, as near as we can tell, it's just not true, like on a physical kind of quantum basis, if you will. The real problems with it, in my estimation, is that it reduces the impact of luck-based factors in people's lives and makes all of their outcomes based on like whether or not they manifested hard enough, essentially. Yeah. So it's dressing up survivorship bias in a really beautiful costume and putting that person on stage and saying, wow, they just manifested harder than you did. This stuff really starts to get messy when we think about historical atrocities, or we think about a lot of horrible stuff that's going on in the world these days. Like, did those people call that into their lives? I don't think a rational person would say that they did. Yeah. I think a rational person would say that there are incredibly powerful and fairly dark forces at work here in the physical minds of men that are causing these things to happen.
Yeah.
So that's a major issue with this whole thing. Another issue with this whole thing for me is that the people who tend to promote manifestation-based thinking have been inordinately lucky in their lives. They've been enormously lucky. So of course they would believe in the law of attraction, right? If you've gotten to a point in your life where you are standing up on that stage and you are making the money involved in doing that to talk to a room of 1,000 people about how if they just like take your course or apply your manifesting ideas, they too will be as successful as you. Well, yeah, you're probably going to feel like that's true. Then in terms of what we're talking about today, my biggest problem practically with manifesting is that it, in my estimation, removes the part of the process that's actually the most important, which is consistent effort, right? So let's think about manifesting. You have a thought, you visualize the thought, you believe the thought, you have positive thoughts about the thought. I believe I am worthy of money. I believe I am worthy of finding the love of my life. I believe I am worthy of winning the lottery, you know, whatever it is for you. I'm doing some money-based ones because money is conventionally one of the things that people really focus on manifesting. There are manifestation courses out there that are quite expensive that are aimed at helping you manifest more money into your life. The fundamental rule of the law of attraction is that thoughts become things. It's not when you change your thoughts, hopefully it activates new behaviors. And then if you pursue those behaviors consistently and with effort, your life will get a little bit better, right? The whole lever here that we're focused on in the psychological frame is changing your behavior in useful ways. Just changing the thought and focused on thinking the thought over and over again and thinking that that's going to get you somewhere could actually impede somebody from changing their behavior in the ways that really matter out in the world. And that, I think, is the single biggest problem with the actual structure of this more kind of psycho-spiritual approach to manifesting. And so I'm going to toss it to you here, Dad, and you're welcome to speak to anything that I've said so far.
This is one of those areas where in our relationship, I'm a little more out there than you are. And it's okay. And we're finding, I think, good ways to talk with each other about this. And maybe also, when I think about the really shrill arguments between, I'll say, dogmatic atheists on the one hand, and then on the other hand, people who come at this from a much more religious or spiritual frame, you know, those arguments can get very heated and problematic. And I'm really glad in a way that you and I can kind of talk about this and model being able to talk about it in a respectful and thoughtful way that moves the ball forward. Okay. So everything you said, I totally agree with on the one hand. And also two things. In my view of reality, I think there actually is evidence for truly unaccountable, inexplicable ways in which intention or mental activity somehow seemed to manifest in physical form in this reality. On the one hand. On the other hand, those instances, even if we grant them, even if those exist, they're very rare. They're edge cases. And so even for those who believe in the actuality of those phenomena, it's important to appreciate that even if they do once in a while come true, they're a very small fraction of all the phenomena in this life, most of which are due to that first category of causes. And I see people getting very fascinated with this supernatural category of, you know, somehow magical manifestation, you know, and even if you grant its possibility, it's a very, very tiny fraction of whatever's going to make a good difference for you in this life. So you know, it's kind of cool, maybe, and where should you put most of your attention? Point two, I have an experience of this, and I know many, 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 many people around the world who have an experience of engaging in practices that, in the mind of the person who's engaging them, have some connection to supernatural matters. There's an invocation of angels, or even going all the way to the transcendental, kind of however that might be for somebody.
Yeah, I think most prayer processes are what you're describing.
Yeah. And for them, they're very meaningful. They're sincere.
Totally.
They're not trying to enroll people in their workshops about it. Or if they are, it's extremely sincere and you know, ethical and well managed. And still, what happens inside yourself as that sense of releasing into the divine, even if that process is meaningful to a person, in part because of its supernatural, even divine/transcendental associations, it's largely, if not entirely, through natural processes of their own experiences, their own experiencing, their own neurons firing away as the underlying basis for the experiences they're having of connecting with God. And that's ultimately where the impact resides. And so I'm naming a category in which people get meaningful benefits that manifest in ordinary reality, whether or not those benefits are in fact the result in part of the mechanisms of action that are supernatural or transcendental. Nonetheless, the benefits, run through the natural body-mind process. And that's really worth appreciating if you are someone like me who has some interest in those supernatural, if not transcendental matters.
Great. And I think that's totally fair for the record that, and I love how you're moving the location of emphasis to what we're doing day after day after day. And you can pray day after day after day. I think that having a consistent practice, regardless of whether or not it is more secular or it is more spiritual in nature, is obviously an incredibly powerful resource for people. For whatever reason, it is an incredibly powerful resource for people. One of the most consistent findings in research is that religious people, on average, are happier than not religious people. I think that you can chalk a lot of that up to the consistency of engagement with a body of knowledge and a body of resource for people that's deeply psychologically meaningful. Like just the optimism that can be inherent in the idea that something is out there looking out for you on some level. Like, wow, that is a very powerful resource, very, very helpful for getting through a difficult moment in life. So totally there for all of that, even regardless of whether or not it's personally meaningful for me. I totally get that it's very meaningful for many people. I think that we did a pretty good job here of getting through this without falling into too many of the holes that could strew our path.
I thought it was world class and good.
We really navigated that one. So now, and I might even put this timestamp into the timestamps for the episodes. Like, if you want to skip all of that and just get to the more practical stuff, here we are. So I want to actually dig into this and think about, okay, let's take this on face value. Let's, inside of that more, mostly inside of that more psychological frame, where we're talking about really identifying what we care about, changing our thoughts related to that thing, all of that kind of stuff. How can we get more of what we want? And how can we use these internal mechanisms to, in a word, manifest those things? One of the really cool ideas that you bump into if you, as I did to prep for this episode, watch 10 to 20 videos on manifesting, which might be why I've been clawing on the inside of my office over the last week or so.
I feel for you.
But a really cool idea, that is very psychoanalytic in nature, is that we get what we subconsciously believe we are worthy of receiving. And so if we have kind of low self-worth or low self-belief, we're not going to go after the things that we really want because we take ourselves off the field before the game even starts, right? It's like the old, I forget if this is Michael Jordan and Wayne Gretzky or whoever, but you miss 100% of the shots you don't take.
Yep.
Right? And so the first step of this process to me is all of that content related to self-worth, self-efficacy, and even self-respect. And I'm wondering, what do you think about that, Dad?
I think that you're really nailing it. I think there's a middle ground where we're not so sure we're worthy, but we're willing to stick our necks out. And yeah, I think a little later, you're going to talk about working through inhibitions that get in the way of, our goal manifestation, goal accomplishment.
Well, just because you named this, Dad, I think that we can kind of almost bump ahead to that as we start to go through this kind of a process, and particularly for people who have more of who are working around self-worth related issues or self-efficacy related issues, there is often an extremely loud voice in the mind that is all of the reasons you can't do that thing, or the fears that you have related to it. Because like when we change our patterns that in ways that bring us closer to what we really care about, it's funny how painful a process that can be for people. You were even talking about something on a recent episode that's really stuck with me. The notion that like good news can challenge our defenses. When we start to get what we want, we can feel kind of imperiled by that because it takes us away from our secure, stable ground. So anything you want to say about that, I think would be great.
That's really cool. One thing that's been really helpful for me about this in an interesting way is to move beyond affirmative beliefs in helplessness and low worth, or affirmative beliefs in agency and worth, and to, in a way, neutralize both of those by adopting don't know mind, beginner's mind, where I don't know if I deserve it. I don't know if I don't deserve it. Don't know. And I'm going to water the fruit tree, right? I don't know if it'll give me an apple. I don't know if I deserve an apple, but I'm going to water the fruit tree and see what happens. And that kind of don't know spirit is in there. So I literally just led a workshop on self-worth. People can check it out. If you want a scholarship for it, happy to give it to you and all the rest of that, or you can, pay for it. But anyway, self-worth, right? And
it's so funny. Even when we're selling stuff, we try to give it away for free. We just can't help ourselves. But go ahead.
It's cool. Okay. So not knowing. So I would say that. So I think on the one hand, there's definitely a place for deepening the well springs. I called them the 5 well springs of worth in the workshop. People can check it out. So there's a place for that. And in one of those well springs had to do with the narratives we tell ourselves. And it can be really helpful to move into a not knowing place, then take the steps that are in front of you.
One of the things that I really love about that, Dad, is that it helps us work with our conditioning.
Yeah.
Because as we've talked about on the podcast all the time, childhood has a very long shadow. The early beliefs we form are very impactful for us. So just moving into, I don't know if I can get to full-on self-worth here, but I'm going to start to relax some of my attachment to or my conditioning around some of these beliefs that I formed early on. That is an enormous part of the process for people. And that alone can take a very long time and be very deep work. And it's very valuable.
Yeah. Think of the inhibitions against taking action, swinging for the fences. One, they're very much about avoiding risking the dreaded experience. So there's this expectation, which is a kind of knowing, a prediction of the dreaded experience. If I speak from the heart or publish my poetry or stand on stage and sing or, grab the microphone at the club on comedy night, okay, but if you don't know, if you're in the frame of don't know, it might go badly, might go well, don't know. I'm going to give it a whirl, and I do know that I'm going to make the efforts that I can. I don't know if you'll love me, but I'm going to ask you to love me anyway, and we'll see what happens, right?
So we've built in some of those positive thoughts, positive beliefs about ourselves. At least we're working around them. Maybe we've embraced a little bit more don't know mind along the way. We're starting to work with any of the inhibitions that we have to that. The next step is goal clarity.
Yeah.
What are we going after? Yeah. What do we care about? What do you want, man? That's the content that for me, I've been kind of surprised that when we talk about it on the podcast, people connect to it so much because so many people struggle to really identify what they want. And if there are a lot of things in manifesting that I've kind of taken some shots at during this episode so far, that's the part of it that I think has the most value. That notion of clarity around what are your goals? What do you care about? What are you really going after?
I've definitely been really big on this one. So I have things to say.
Huge part of your work. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. I'll try to be short and sweet. Fundamentally, it's useful to have overarching purposes, especially those that we can surrender to. One way of understanding will, and which evades willpower fatigue, is to think of will as surrendering to the best within you so that it carries you along. That's a completely different way to frame purposes. So we start to identify what are those deep values or longings or ways of being that are wholesome and valuable and wise and useful. How can I get in touch with them, and how can I release into them so that it is they who which carry me along. That's a very different framing than most of the goal setting, which is dualistic, sets the goal outside yourself, and then you have to scratch and claw toward it. So as that of a frame, I think it's helpful for people to ask themselves, okay, however successful or not I've been in my life, what do I still really long for as an experience? And this is where you are just extremely right on the money again and again, highlighting the ways in which what really matters is our experience of things. And so if we long for a nice big house, the real question is, what would be the experience you'd have if you owned that nice big house?
Yeah.
And even
means versus ends.
Yeah.
Totally.
Are there other ways to get that experience? What do you still long for? Another is, what if you'd experienced it? Would it have made a lot of difference in your childhood or your last job or your career or your last relationship? Can you look for that experience? So in some ways you start to find overarching purposes and values that you're clear about and that you can name to yourself. And then absolutely, it's really important to break them down. One of the things that I did once as a very useful exercise was I kind of named roughly 8 or 9 priority areas of my life. And then I forced myself to rank order them so that if I only get one, literally one, right, what's it going to be? And then, okay, that leaves, let's say you start with 9, now you got 8 left. Okay, if you only get 1 out of the remaining 8, what's it going to be? And then if you only get 1 out of the remaining 7, what's it going to be? That kind of forced choice can be really, very, very penetrating. And then you ask yourself, okay, how am I living in relationship to these real priorities? Am I living consistently with regard to them? And then you start thinking about how to get your life to line up more in terms of them. That could be a huge wake-up call for people. And then the last thing I'll just say that's helpful, maybe, is to think about the law of little things. Lots of little bad things take us to bad places. Lots of little good ones take us to good places. So what are the little things that you could do every day that would probably add up to about an hour that would be different from the way you typically spend your day? Maybe 2 hours at the most. It might be not interrupting people. It might be drinking less. It might be going to bed 10 minutes earlier. It might be getting up 10 minutes earlier. Whatever's there for you, working on your poetry, working on your book, working out in the gym, 1 to 2 hours a day, that if you actually sustained effort in those specific ways, that it would really add up to something big over time.
Yeah, I really like that because I think that the single biggest pitfall that people fall into over and over again in the personal development world is they try to cannonball into the deep end of the pool. They try to create dramatic change, try to do it all at once, and then they flame out because of course they flame out. I mean, it would be so hard to not flame out. It's not their fault. That's just the way it is. You're trying to move mountains here, but as opposed to embracing the day-to-day small steps that typically get us from point A to point B. I want to mention one other thing here before we move on to the next one, and that's really being okay with using pain points as a guide to what you really want. It can be very hard for people often to talk about the positive things that they aspire to.
Yeah.
Like I had a video recently talking about a way to go through a process of identifying what you really want and what you really care about in life. And I ran through a bunch of more like positive orientations that a person can have, things they could aspire to, things they could look for. Something I didn't really mention very much in that video that I kind of wished I had is that for a lot of people, it's way easier for them to describe what's not working right now. Way easier. Pain is salient in our lives, right? And, you can use that sometimes. You don't want to stay there. You don't want to stay and just griping about your life, of course, but it can be very helpful to look through and go, okay, what is not working for me right now? What could I do to change what's not working for me right now? Then another piece of this, Dad, that I think is really interesting that I haven't really heard people talk about is the role of authenticity as part of this process.
That's interesting. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, because we want things for all kinds of different reasons, right? But which of those wants are our wants and which of those wants are leftovers from an earlier time in life? Maybe they've been kind of given to us by a salient figure in our lives. Maybe they're they're totally performative in nature. You want it because you feel like you should want it, or you want it because you have the feeling of others watching you as you're engaged in this wanting process. Like, do you really care about this fundamentally? Because we can pursue both more authentic and more inauthentic wants, but I do think that the feeling that we're left with at the end is going to be very different. Having worked with people around these topics for a long time, are there things that you think help people figure out what's more authentic versus less authentic? Because it can actually be quite hard a lot of the time.
Well, I think it can be quite hard because we internalize all kinds of standards from other people. And we also want approval. We want to impress others. We're social monkeys. It's understandable that we want to have high status, in our hunter-gatherer or baboon troop. So that's true. It's all very natural. And I find myself, first of all, really emphasizing the place for just simply authentic self-expression. The more you practice speaking from your heart, sharing your experience as it is, being real about it, doing so appropriately, and which includes doing this with people that are not going to mistreat you because you did this. The more you do that, the more you get in touch with yourself, the more you wake down, not just wake up, then your goals, your values, your purposes, your plans and priorities become increasingly authentic themselves. Part one. Part two, there's a term, object relations, that you're familiar with, which was developed in psychodynamic psychotherapy. And it's the idea that we represent knowledge about the world in this two-part frame in which there's the self, me, and then there's other people. And this can be very specific, like there's the me I am if a police officer pulls me over and writes me a traffic ticket, and there's the me I am when I'm just hanging out with my friends watching sports, and then there's the me I am when I stand up in front of a group to give a talk. And, these are the different kind of object relations frames, object being the other, okay? It's really interesting to consider what your real aims are in this one wild and precious life you have, as Mary Oliver put it, that are decoupled from any reference to others. That you, in other words, that you do them entirely in an inner-directed, self-referential way. I don't mean self as the ego. I mean self essentially as the entirety of the person. It's really cool. You realize there's a kind of freedom there, partly because you realize that honestly, most of what you do, other people won't care much about. If they do praise you or blame you, that will come and go. At the end of the day, what will remain is your own authentic reasons for doing it and the fulfillment and satisfaction or the accomplishment of important purposes you have in life, which might include serving others. That's what will remain when the dust settles on all that.
And that's really great, Dad. And a big part of that process, unfortunately, or maybe for better or worse, is just the reality of the consistent grind of it. Whether it is that we're consistently grinding around going through those stages that you just mentioned, or going through that kind of a process of investigating the interior, whether we're grinding out in the world. One of the, as I mentioned earlier, one of the big problems with the more kind of psycho-spiritual approaches to manifesting is that there's no clear transition from what's going on between your ears and what's going on out in the world. So for me, I think a really important question for people is, what do you need in order to make steps toward this goal? Do you need to get more okay with things being imperfect? Do you need to work on your perfectionism, in other words? Do you need to figure out how you can 80-20 something? Do you need to figure out how you can do this in just 15 minutes a day rather than in an hour a day because you don't have an hour a day? Do you need certain kinds of external resources? Do you need to develop different internal skills? Like, what's going to really get you there? And I've noticed, particularly for people who have a little bit more of that spiritual orientation, sometimes the mundanity of that, there can be an inhibition around it, and like accepting the reality of just like, yeah, you got to grind it out is often really tough for people. I don't wonder what you've seen about that.
It's a great question. And I really have been in this world. reflecting on it, on the one hand, going back to your point about authenticity, which I think is which is all too easy to underestimate the importance of your point. It's a really good point. I'm really taking this away because my experience is that when people remove the inhibitions, when they remove the obscurations, when they remove the hindrances, usually, naturally, there's an inherent movement that originates within people to actualize themselves, as Maslow explored, and also to contribute to the world and to participate in life in a full way, developing their competencies and being somewhat playful with it all along the way. I think that's actually innate, and that's the good news. So if a person is not manifesting in ways that are authentic to them, a first question is, okay, got it. What's getting in your way? Not your fault. What's getting in your way? That's wonderful. I think it's also true in our modern culture, in ways that are historically unprecedented, because people can kind of phone it in life and not make much effort and drift along. Maybe their job isn't terribly satisfying, but they're not going to starve to death. So the incentives that my dad faced growing up on a ranch in North Dakota and his grandparents really faced are not so present today. And people can acquire a certain habit of what the Buddha called sloth and torpor as one of the 5 hindrances to progressing on your path. They're just kind of lazy. So I suspect both things are true, that if we remove the inhibitions, there is an authentic energy that has momentum to it that moves forward. And also we need to make sure that we haven't acquired the habit of, frankly, a certain amount of laziness or flakiness, and that we appreciate the singular gift of our own one wild and precious life. We appreciate it enough to, get up off the couch and surrender to that authentic engine inside that wants to carry you along, and then put it into practice in actual daily ways that are not going to exhaust you. They're not going to stress you out terribly. It just means, walk your talk each day, and then go to bed that night knowing that you put in a good day's work. It was enough. And you can wake up the next morning raring to go.
And I think a big part of that also is this final step of this process, which is about cultivating more proactive mindset to me. So this means viewing yourself as something that's flexible and can change, something that can bear the weight, bear the effort of what you're describing here, Dad, that day-to-day process of moving through it. A person who's capable of dealing with changing situations, because change is an inherent part of life. And that belief that we've talked about in the last several episodes that I've kept on returning to, of a view of the self as being sturdy, capable, and able to resist trouble, resist struggle, resist bad things happening out in the world, fundamentally sturdy. And as a source of your own safety is a big part of that as well. Like the belief that you can really keep yourself secure, I think, is a huge part of what allows people to then go and do all of these other things that we're talking about. And so, that's a big part of this process as well. Another part of it might be accepting the reality of difficulty. Like, life's hard sometimes. Bad things are going to happen. And I think that those 6-ish things that we've talked about here, what are they, to summarize? First step, we're working around that like self-worth, self-efficacy parts of things. Second, we're setting intentions. We're creating a clear target. We're identifying what we really care about. Third, we're exploring authenticity. Fourth, we're embracing the reality of consistent effort in life. Then, as kind of a little thing that runs across all of these, I would say, we're working with some of the inhibitions and the fears that can arise along the way. And then finally, that along the way, cultivating a proactive mindset as well, I think could be really helpful. That, to me, is really what manifesting is, in that more psychological, natural frame process. Like, that's really what we're doing. And a big part of that, Dad, gets to changing those underlying beliefs. And we talked about this a bit already when we talked about that first category, right? Self-worth and so on. But we often get a question from people, how do I actually do that? You talk about changing beliefs all the time, but I try to hold a different thought in my mind or think something different about myself, and it just doesn't stick. Like, what do I do? That sounds nice, but how do I do it? And this is basically what you do. So I mostly just want to kick the ball over into your court here, and you're welcome to go wherever you want with this. But I would love you to walk us through a really practical example of how somebody could do this in their life. I know one that's really important for people is issues related to self-worth, but if you want to take it in a different direction, you're totally welcome to.
Well, that's great. Okay, so let's suppose that a person would like to take a step in their life, and they're aware of the fact that low self-worth, a sense of self-doubt, inadequacy, a view of themselves as not actually capable or likely to be successful at taking that step, which could be in the interpersonal space, going out and dating again, or pursuing a particular person. They just don't feel worthy to it, or taking steps in their career. That's what you're getting at, right? Let's suppose that's the example.
Yep. Great.
I want to name two things first, which is that if we take action that starts to produce results that reassure us or help us disconfirm those old beliefs, that can be really helpful. And also, if we're having experiences, somatic experiences below the cognitive level, in other words, of belief, if we're having experiences for example, in this case, feeling loved, feeling valued, feeling cared about, experiences of our own natural goodness, well, those experiences can gradually change beliefs as well. So I'm naming that beliefs can be changed based on external events and conditions, some of which we can foster, and also beliefs can be changed from the bottom up. That said, I'm going to focus now on how to do it top down. So step one, name the belief, identify it. We can't change what we're not aware of. Freud famously said we call it the unconscious because it's unconscious. It's not conscious. You can't address it if it's not conscious. So name the beliefs. It can be helpful to do it as an exercise where you write it on paper. Sometimes when you actually put it on paper and you don't censor yourself, you really let the parts of you that believe that belief and are pushing it in their misguided but well-intended efforts to help you. When you really let them talk, in effect, you really put the belief down. When you step back from it, you realize, wow, that's just so not true. But just let yourself see it. Say it out loud. A nice, interesting exercise is to pick a belief, identify it, put it into language, and then say it out loud with or without another person hearing you. And then, ask yourself how you feel once you said it. That too. In other words, when we kind of get it out of the voice in the back of the head, murmuring away, whispering.
Yeah, I think this is a really great process, Dad, where you're making the unconscious conscious. You're trying to put words to the voice. You're really spelling out what is it that you think. In part because then, when something has taken a physical form, or sometimes we talk about doing this with fears too, people will have amorphous fears floating around in the back of their mind. But then when they really have to write down what the specific fear is, it becomes much easier to work with because it's bounded in nature. It's clear.
That's exactly right. You're getting worm tongue out of your head and out in front so you can really see what that character's saying. Okay, so that's one. You do that. Then second, once you have it out on the table, it's really useful to ask yourself, okay, what is true about this belief? So you give it its due. You don't attack it initially. You appreciate it. You respect it. Well, what is true about it? You see that part? Like, is it true in certain settings? Is it true with certain people? Has it been true in the past, right? Third, what's the function the belief serves? This is very useful. What are the benefits of that belief? What does it do in terms of helping me be safe, to protect myself, to get along with other people, to kind of shore up my feeling of identity or my own worth? What are the functions it serves? It might be a function of leading me to not do stuff that when I was a kid got me punished. Like a belief that, I'm, not very smart would then just naturally lead me to not speak up in some kind of loose way that got laughed at when I was in school.
Yeah, that what the function part of it is huge, I think.
And then in the fourth step, you ask yourself, well, what's not true about this belief? And what are the costs to me and others of it? And here too, you're being, in the way I've described, you're being neutral, you're being fair, you're exploring it. What's not true about it? Is it actually true? So we explore that, and you see the ways in which it's not true. And you also explore, what's the cost to me of this belief? So the third question is about what's the payoff? What's the function? Now, in the fourth question, we're asking ourselves what's untrue and what are the costs? And then finally, you get to the fifth step, which is about what would be an alternative belief that would be more true and less costly in the service of whatever is legitimate in the function that you've clarified for yourself in the third step. In other words, think of the belief as a vehicle. It got you here. And yeah, it's kind of a cramped and smelly and leaky rowboat, but you know how to work it. It gets you across the bay. All right. What would be a better vehicle?
Yeah.
What would be a better vehicle? So now you're starting to identify that better vehicle. The sixth step, now you've started to identify the belief system. And this could be broader. It could be a sense of perspective. It could be meanings. It could be interpretations. This could involve expectations, assumptions, predictions, views of yourself, views of the world, views of the past, views of the future, views of others. Okay. Now that you've, in the sixth, now that you've identified what the better way is, the better perspectives, now you want to develop conviction. You want to transfer from that old, leaky, smelly rowboat, cramped and awkward, to a much better vehicle. You want to transition to it now in the sixth step. So you're helping yourself to start to really believe the new perspectives. So you're stepping away from the old views because you've disputed them, you've seen what's not true about them, you've recognized what's costly to you and others about them, you've done that part, and now you're stepping into the new belief frame by repeating it to yourself, by surfacing your yes buts that get in the way. And you want to really ask yourself, am I prepared to step away from that old, familiar, but problematic way of being into this new way of being? Which one do you want to win? You've got two lawyers arguing in your head. The old lawyer, you're a schmuck, you suck, you're no good. Or the new lawyer who's like, wait a minute here. You really want, in the sixth step, the new way of looking at things to prevail. And then ways of implementing that are to know what conviction feels like. Know what it feels like to really believe something is true. I think about, I believe, Oprah's question to people, what's one thing you know for sure? What does it feel like to know something for sure? And then can you help yourself gradually inhabit that way of relating to this particular belief? And then also take a look at how would you manifest this belief? How would you put it into practice? If this is about manifesting, okay, how would you apply it? How would you operationalize that belief? How would you act upon that belief in new ways? Write those down or know what they are, visualize them. And then if you really want a bonus here, you can, quite helpfully, and I've done this, imagine yourself acting on the basis, this is a very effective trick to the brain. It's 3 steps. Imagine yourself acting on the basis of the new way of being, and realistically imagine the rewards of it for you and others and how wonderful it will be. Okay. Imagine yourself working through yes buts or obstructions or difficulties in realistic ways successfully with a felt sense of how rewarding that would be. Step 1. Step 2, you then just imagine kind of quickly what it would be like to operate on the basis of the old belief with awareness of what's not true about it, and also potentially how it was installed in you by people that you're not very happy about, sticking that sucker in your head and programming you with it, and observe the cost of it. Okay, great. So you run out the second scenario, operating on the basis of that old way of looking. Then you make an existential choice. Which one? Which one do you pick? It's you. It's you existentially. Which one do you pick? People usually pick the higher road belief. And then in the third step, imagine yourself again, maybe more quickly, operating on the basis of the new belief and experiencing in your imagination, and ideally in a felt way, how good it will be for you and others to do that.
That's really great, Dad. That's a fantastic summary of an enormous body of thought, for starters. So it's a great job on just like tidying that up so much. And I think it's a great answer to that question that people have all the time. How do I actually go about installing this new thing into me? Because it can feel like this very fuzzy and vague process, and is often very vague in how people talk about it. You just you have this new belief and you just believe it. No, there are actually deliberate steps that you can go through to maybe not perfectly bake it into you, because, that's uncommon, but to really have this new way of being increasingly internalized through action. Also, how we behave out in the world becomes positively reinforcing. We start to acquire evidence that we really are the way that this new belief says we are. If we just go through all those processes that you described, but our behavior doesn't change, we never have any evidence.
Yeah.
Right? So an important part of it, as you were saying, putting into action, creating evidence and finding that evidence and letting that evidence sink in. So I really love that. I think it's an incredibly important part of this whole process. And man, I'm really happy with how this whole thing went. This could have been a total mess, honestly. And I think that we navigated it very skillfully. I'm really pleased with it. I actually love this whole episode. Yeah, so thanks for doing this with me today, Dad. I think that was really rich.
Oh, thank you. And thank you for being artful with it all and tolerant of my more woo-woo aspects.
Hey, got it. We all got to have a little tolerance in our lives here. So I just had a great time today talking with Rick about manifesting and about what we can do to take a psychologically inclined approach to some of these ideas. I thought it was super valuable for me personally, and I hope that the people who are listening got a lot out of it too. I was a little nervous going into this conversation because I am not a manifesting person. There are a lot of people who really care about manifesting, and particularly really care about it and believe in it in the more metaphysical way that we described during the conversation. And I thought that this would be an episode where it would be really easy for us to fall into a whole bunch of sinkholes while talking about it and get bogged down in a lot of parts of it that just wouldn't be that interesting for people. But by the end of it, I was very happy with all of the stuff that we covered. I found it really interesting, and I thought it was great how Rick began the conversation by breaking how to think about manifesting into these different buckets. The first bucket is just the pure material frame, and that includes all of the psychological tools that we talk about on the podcast. The second bucket were plausible processes that we don't yet understand. So this is the stuff that we're going to find out in 10, 20, 50 years as science continues to grind away in its natural process. The third bucket is metaphysical or transcendental things that are working on the physical world. And then the fourth bucket is the truly transcendental. And we spent most of this conversation talking about that first bucket, because manifestation, to put it into a phrase, is bringing what's in our mind into reality. We know that our beliefs and our thoughts about the world play a big role in this process because they impact our behavior out in the world. If you're carrying around a bunch of beliefs that get in the way of identifying or pursuing your goals, designing a life that would feel good for you, and pursuing those goals and objectives consistently, then of course you're going to have a very difficult time getting what you want out of life. And believing that you can accomplish something is the first step to actually accomplish it. So in that more material frame, we're talking about a pretty delineated process of developing self-belief and self-efficacy, maybe self-worth alongside that, really thinking that you can accomplish the thing that you're setting out to accomplish. Then second, goal clarity and lifestyle design. What is it that you really want? And we talked about that at some length during the episode. Then third, discipline, applying consistent effort over time. This is one of the places where I think the law of attraction and more metaphysical manifesting really falls apart, because it focuses on the thoughts you have, not the direct ways in which those thoughts impact your physical actions out in the world. You can think that you are worthy of a master's degree until you are blue in the face, but if you don't actually submit the papers by the application deadline, you're never going to get there. And then finally, we want to cultivate a mindset that tends to lead to good outcomes for us. This is one that is flexible. We talk about psychological flexibility a lot. Rationally optimistic. We are going to search for meaning and purpose and the good parts, even amidst a difficult life. And then having a growth orientation, the belief that we can learn what we need to learn in order to succeed. Now, manifesting, if we want to interpret it kind of charitably, is a way to understand that very practical process. And it can be particularly helpful for people who don't really have a background in psychoeducation, or maybe they have more of a background in spiritual practice. And it can help them connect the dots between the more metaphysical and the more psychological or realized out in the world. And Rick talked at some length about the value of those more practices of faith, spiritual practices, metaphysical practices. And one of the things that I mentioned during the conversation is that we know from research that people who are religious are often happier than people who are not. That's a real resource for people. Where things become problematic for me is when there is an attempt to add evidence to something that does not have evidence by using a lot of psychobabble and technobabble, by misusing terminology, by making vague allusions to quantum mechanics without really understanding how any of that actually works. It just feels kind of mystical and out there. So sure, we'll use that language and we'll kind of adopt it as part of our process. And there are many things that bug me about this, but what bugs me about it the most is that this is a fantastic way to exploit vulnerable people. Because what you see over and over and over again is this technobabble, this quantum flapdoodle, to quote physicist Murray Gell-Mann, applied to manipulate, to coerce, and to frankly take money from vulnerable groups of people who are not as educated around these issues, who don't really understand the terminology. And I'm sure that there are instances where the word quantum is used appropriately in a personal development context, but the overwhelming majority of the time, it's used incorrectly, or even worse, as a sort of excuse for why an idea has no evidence to support it. Like, well, we don't know. Maybe it's just quantum, right? I would be totally fine with most of the stuff embedded in the law of attraction if the people had the honesty to just say, oh, it's faith. Oh, I just kind of think that things work that way. Okay. The whole point of faith is that it is without evidence. That's why you need faith. If you had evidence, you wouldn't need faith. And that's okay. That's an incredibly meaningful resource for many, many people. It's that lack of honesty and that attempt to scientize things that are not scientific that really rubs me the wrong way. Then alongside that, there are some specific problems with The Secret in particular and the law of attraction as well that I just think just create a lot of issues here. The law of attraction is essentially a way to take credit for luck and also to not appropriately credit the role of luck in the lives of less fortunate people. If somebody's circumstances are entirely based on the power of their thoughts, and if we call in the things that happen to us based on the energy of those unique thoughts, then everything that happens to you, whether good or bad, is your fault, definitionally. And this is spelled out on Oprah's website, where somebody, maybe she, maybe somebody else, but somebody writes, the energy you put into the world, both good and bad, is exactly what comes back to you. You don't have to dig very deep to find the problems with this viewpoint. And suggesting that we can overcome any obstacle through the power of thought alone completely ignores any kind of systemic issue, any kind of systemic problem that a person might be dealing with. Because it turns out that indeed, our thoughts aren't the only thing that matters, people. Then we went from there into a roadmap for practical manifesting. So this is that more bucket one, psychologically inclined approach to manifesting. So here's a quick summary of that 6-step process. First, we focus on improving self-worth, self-efficacy, and self-respect. Because a manifestation principle, if you want to call it that, is that we get what we subconsciously believe we are worthy of receiving. So if we have low self-worth or self-belief, we're not going to go after the things that we really want. So if we don't think that we're worthy of something, we're never going to put in the effort required to go out and get it. Then second, huge piece of this puzzle, setting intentions and creating clear targets. And this gets to goal clarity, planning, and lifestyle design of different kinds. To start with, what do you really want? And Rick talked about this process in detail. He really got in there about how we can explore this. Third, the exploration of authenticity is part of this process. We want things for all kinds of different reasons. Why do we want them? And are they our wants or are they somebody else's wants? And Rick here talked about authentic self-expression. How can we come into the world? How can we embody ourselves in a way that's a little more real, a little bit more felt, a little bit more true to who we feel we really are, as opposed to being true to the mask that we've been carrying around. Fourth, facing the reality of consistent effort. We get where we want to go based on taking many, many small, real steps. Accepting that can be really challenging for people, and it's often surprising how many inhibitions come up to the reality of that day-to-day work. And that's the 5th step, working with inhibitions or the fears that emerge along the way. Changing patterns in ways that bring us closer to what we really care about or the outcomes that we actually want from life is often surprisingly difficult for people, in part because it puts us in close contact with vulnerable psychological material. This is often the stuff that we have buried deep down, that we have not unearthed yet. It often relates to painful experiences that happened to us much earlier in life. And, putting yourself out there, period, including putting yourself out there by just saying normal things like, I am a fundamentally worthy person, or I am a good person. It can be really surprising how difficult that can be for somebody. Then along the way, we're trying to cultivate a more proactive, more helpful mindset that brings us closer to the things that we really want. We're trying to view ourselves as more flexible, as somebody who is capable of dealing with shifting situations and embracing and overcoming difficulties. And we're increasingly developing that view of the self as something that keeps us safe. You are safe because you are who you are, not because of the circumstances that you are in. That feeling of fundamental safety is often a huge resource for people. And then at the end of the conversation, I asked Rick to walk through a practical example of changing a belief and embedding a new belief inside of us that can support those desires to manifest something new and different. And I thought he did a fantastic job of running through this. It was, again, a 6-step process. First, putting the belief into clarity, bringing it from the unconscious to the conscious. And we can sometimes do this by really writing it down very clearly. Then second, asking ourselves, what's the function of that belief? Beliefs exist for reasons. What got that belief into us and why has it still stuck around? Particularly, most of the time, what is it protecting us from? Then third, what's not true about the belief? What are the things that we really can see about it that aren't accurate? How has it not lined up with what's actually happened to us or what is really true about who we are as a person? Fourth, what are the costs of the belief? What are the things that it is preventing us from getting that we really care about? And then fifth, really great question, what is an alternative belief that would be more true and come with less costs that is also in the service of that same function? That is an incredible question to ask. Then finally, after you've identified that new belief, argue for it and want it to win. Really loved this episode. I'm also really curious what the feedback for it is going to be. Leave a comment down below if you're watching on YouTube. You can leave a rating and hopefully a positive review, even if you disagreed with some of the things that we said during the episode. on iTunes or Spotify. That really helps us out. You can also send an email to contact@beingwellpodcast.com if you want to get in touch with me, or send me a message over on Patreon. That's patreon.com/beingwellpodcast. And for just a couple of dollars a month, you can support the show and receive a bunch of bonuses in return. If you've made it this far and you somehow haven't subscribed to the podcast yet, please subscribe. That really does help us out. And again, thanks so much for listening. This was a bit of a longer one, and I really appreciate the amount of time and attention that our listeners give to the podcast. It is really incredible stuff. I'll talk to you soon. Have a great week.